Public schools are unique places. They function differently and they have a different function from most other places that we experience. And this has everything to do with how they handle issues of cultural diversity and why diversity issues have always been kind of tricky for schools. To see how schools are so different than other places, let's compare them to grocery stores. People choose to go to grocery stores and can often choose which grocery stores they go to. Those who want big selection might go to the local supermarket, while those who want a particular ethnic cuisine might have to choose a more specialized store like a Hispanic or Asian grocery. Or you might go to both. No one expects everyone to go to the same grocery store. Well, that's not true with public schools. In the early days, they were actually called common schools. And the reason is that we actually did want everyone to go to the same schools. Schools were what made us all Americans, and while we might all go to different churches or read different newspapers or go to different groceries, we would all receive our education in common. Not only is that ambitious, but it makes dealing with human diversity tricky. What happens when different people with cultural backgrounds must be taught the same material, or when different people who dislike others' differences have to go to the same school? Grocery stores don't have this problem so much. Schools do and always have. So let's talk about it. In the very early 1800s, schools were generally private, like grocery stores, and it wasn't even compulsory. But that meant that a lot of kids, typically poor ones, didn't actually even go to school. Gradually, localities started providing government-funded common schools, and those eventually became what we know today as public schools. Any child could go, regardless of ability to pay, and mostly for matters of convenience, everyone, at least of the same age, was taught roughly the same things. But as we've seen, that can create problems, involving problems of diversity. One problem it creates is around curriculum. If very different kids can go to the same school, but they are all taught the same things, wouldn't that mean that some kids, the ones the curriculum doesn't fit, will be shortchanged? Let's go back to the grocery store for a second. When different people who eat very different diets go to the same grocery store, the store tries its best to cater to everyone, but it's really just catering to who it thinks the average consumers are. If you have a really specialized diet or are looking for some not very popular ingredients, you might not find them. You'll have to go to a specialty store. But as we've said, schools aren't like grocery stores. They somehow have to serve all potential customers. But any curriculum will likely exclude or marginalize or shortchange at least some of those customers. A very early example of this is the experience of Catholics in early American public schools. Through the mid-1800s, the U.S. population was mostly Protestant, and religion was freely taught in schools. Many kids learned to read by reading the Bible. But which Bible should the schools teach? As historian Stephen Prothero writes, one of the core objectives of public schooling was to create moral citizens. But the only way to instill morality was through religion. The only true religion was Protestantism. The only sure foundation for Protestantism was the Bible, and the only real Bible was the Protestant King James Version. Or so went the prevailing logic. If Catholics wanted to send their children to public schools, schools their taxes paid for, their children would be forced to read from a Bible that they believed was false. They also taught from textbooks like the New England Primer that contained frequent anti-Catholic slurs against the Pope. In 1840s New York, Catholics actually mustered such an impressive protest that the city's government tried a compromise. We will continue to use our Protestant books, but remove any passages from them that might offend Catholics. Needless to say, Catholics were not part of this vetting process. The Protestants left an awful lot of stuff that did offend Catholics, so Catholics began organizing their own Catholic schools. Battles over curriculum have continued, mostly over things like sex education and which versions of history we should be teaching students. Science education also has long had to deal with questions about whether teaching the Darwinian theory of evolution violates religious people's consciences. As I record this video, Americans are engaged in heated discussions about whether and how much we should teach about the evils of slavery and racism as part of American history. Controversies like these are virtually inevitable when the public schools must teach such a diverse student body the same core stuff. Curriculum isn't the only site for this type of conflict, though. Another is the very fact that different people are expected to exist together and have the same right to an education in the same building. And two examples can illustrate this point: the Black struggle for education and the situation of immigrants in American schools. Race-based slavery was made illegal in 1865, but from then until the Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education, Black and white children often attended different schools in many U.S. states. The white population simply didn't want their schools dirtied with the presence of Black children or teachers. So separate they were until at least 1954's Brown versus Board of Education, which overturned the idea of, quote, separate but equal schools. The mandate for integration proved really difficult to enforce, especially in southern states that either refused to follow it, like Arkansas, or tried clever legal tricks to get around it, like Virginia. At a very slow pace, schools did become integrated in all 50 states, but here's the thing. While we all acknowledge that integration was a good thing, even social justice-minded scholars often admit that integration created its own challenges. In a book called Acting White, Stuart Buck writes about how the decision was often detrimental for the black students it attempted to help. The black schools predictably closed, white schools were unwilling to hire black teachers, and black students were now in schools with majority white populations who often didn't want them there and were hostile. Legal scholar Derek Bell more recently argued that looking back, maybe Brown did more harm than good. The problem, he said, was not whether schools should be integrated, but whether black students should receive the same quality education as white students. Brown, he said, allowed for us to focus on integration and overlook the issue of quality. Today, largely because of residential segregation, schools are even as segregated today as they were before Brown. Statistically, racial equality has just not been achieved in education. Then there's the immigrant experience. The U.S. has always struggled here, partly because we've historically taken in a large and diverse group of immigrants. Often, native citizens have been suspicious of immigrants retaining the old ways of the old country, as when schools were eager to Americanize immigrants, particularly Catholic ones who came from Russia and Ireland. Non-white immigrants seemed more threatening, and in some states there's a history of denying Chinese, Japanese, and Mexican immigrants access to public education. More recently, the U.S. has fought over to what extent we should give children of undocumented, often Central and South American immigrants, a public education at all. We've only scratched the surface of how U.S. schools have struggled to meet the needs and demands of such diverse populations. We didn't go over the struggle to establish and define special education services, the sad history of Native American boarding schools, or the fight of different ethnicities to get their history told properly in schools. For anyone interested, here are 2 books I'd recommend that go into some of those diversity conflicts. So as you can see, public schools are unique institutions because they are charged with serving all comers, no matter how diverse, and that's caused and continues to cause problems to do with diversity. Schools struggle with choosing curriculum that responds as well as possible to everyone's diverse interests and needs. Schools also struggle to be places that accommodate everyone while marginalizing no one. It's a tall order that continues to challenge and confound us to this day.